This is Michael Hutchinson from BloodyElbow.com, and today we're going to be talking about the best and worst seasons of TUF. This topic comes up after a bunch of cuts saw TUF cast members leave the UFC. Now we're going to be approaching this topic using my favorite thing in the world, statistics. So here it is. Wow, that's a lot of numbers. So let's break down the categories. We have the seasons ordered by number, not including seasons that had their finale less than a year ago or spin-offs of the original TUF. The next category is the most important, and that's 5+ fights per fighter, which is the number of TUF fighters from that season that went on to have 5 or more UFC fights. The next is UFC fights, which is a total of how many UFC fights the entire TUF cast has accumulated. Active represents the number of fighters from the season that are currently in the UFC. Wins, losses, and win percentage are pretty self-explanatory. The last category shows how many title shots the fighters from that season earned, and in brackets are the amount of champions from that season. So with all that said, what constitutes a good or bad season, and what differentiates between a good and great season? For the best, we'll look at the seasons that have totaled more than 50 fights in the UFC. That cuts things down to 12 seasons. The top 4 seasons on this list stand out more than any other. They all have 100+ fights, have all had multiple contestants earn title shots, and all have positive winning percentages. TUF 2 had fighters like Marcus Davis, Melvin Guillard, Keith Jardine, Josh Berkman, Joe Stevenson, and most notably Rashad Evans. TUF 5 had title contenders Gray Maynard and Nate Diaz, as well as Joe Lozon, Cole Miller, Matt Wyman, and Manny Gamburian. These seasons were great, but they weren't the best. The 2 seasons that stand above the rest are TUF 14 and TUF 1. TUF 14 is the only season of TUF from the past 8 years to produce title contenders. The season featured Brian Caraway, Marcus Brimage, Diego Brandao, Dennis Bermudez, John Dodson, and current UFC champion TJ Dillashaw. Dillashaw remains the only TUF fighter in history to successfully defend a UFC championship. Also, 12 fighters from that season went on to have 5 or more UFC fights. Of course, there isn't a season that can compete with TUF 1. I don't even have to name the fighters from that season. All you need to know is that they have the highest winning percentage out of any season by far, the most combined fights, and the most title shots. They also had 7 cast members who fought at least 15 times in the UFC. So it's pretty easy to tell which seasons were the best. But which seasons were the worst? For this one, I decided to sort the seasons by winning percentage and left out any season with more than 90 total fights, or with a 52 winning percentage. TUF 10 still has 2 active fighters, the most fights of the ones left, and produced very well-known fighters such as Nelson, Schaub, and Mitrione. This leaves us with 6 terrible seasons out of the 19 we started with. Although TUF 6 did suck, it still produced 3 fighters with 10+ fights, with Matt Danzig, George Sorteropoulos, and the only fighter left from that season, Ben Saunders. TUF 9 also sucked, but did produce Ross Pearson and DeMarcus Johnson, both who had 10+ fights. It's the seasons that produce 1 or no quality fighters that should be seen as the worst of the worst. Although season 19 is the most recent on the list, the season is down to 3 active fighters, with Cathal Pendred and Corey Anderson being the season's breakout stars. TUF 12, 13, and 16 share the bottom of the barrel for having only 1 standout fighter, with the rest of the cast doing terrible. Each season has only 1 or 2 active fighters left, even though they aired 5 years ago. For comparison's sake, TUF 5 aired 8 years ago and still has 6 active fighters. Although TUF 12 has the worst winning percentage of any season, it did produce the lone standout of Michael Johnson, who is both active in the UFC and a top 10 lightweight. The actual season was entertaining with GSP and Koscheck, but the fighters failed to live up to the hype. Season 13's lone standout is Tony Ferguson, with only 3 fighters from the season getting more than 3 UFC fights. That's pretty bad, but it doesn't compare to the worst season of all time. Season 16, a season that aired just 3 years ago, only has 2 fighters left, Neil Magny and Sam Alvey. Out of the 16 combined UFC wins from that season, Magny has 9 of those, while Alvey has 3. The season has a cast of 16, yet only 7 fighters got fights in the UFC, and finalists Mike Ricci and Colton Smith were released after fewer than 5 fights. If Neo Magny goes on a title run, then this season would be saved from being called the worst, but as of right now, I would consider it the worst season in the history of TUF. So those are the stats and my opinion on the best and worst seasons of TUF. What do you think were the best and worst seasons of TUF, and what stats do you think prove that? Leave me your comments, and make sure to follow me on Twitter @TheMikeyHutch. Thanks for watching.